Kia ora koutou. Ngā mihi kia koutou. Welcome to this webisode on urban regenerative agriculture. My name is Alina Siegfried. I'm the author of the Our Regenerative Future content series, produced in partnership with Pure Advantage and the Edmund Hillary Fellowship. This is our 10th webinar this evening in this 12-part series, which followed on from a 15-part written content series that was published back in early May. And together we've been able to take a real deep dive into the world of regenerative agriculture over the past few months. It's been wonderful to see such momentum and energy around these conversations. And now we've expanded the remit a little bit from purely regenerative agriculture into other primary industries, including forestry, horticulture and tourism as well, which is going to be next week's webinar. This is partially in recognition that we all have a role to play in the regeneration of our environment, our social systems and our economy, and that we need integrated approaches to bring about systems level transitions in this rapidly changing world today. So in today's webinar, we're going to be exploring the opportunity for regenerative agriculture in our towns and cities. And we have a fully stacked panel of experts to answer your questions. So I'll introduce them briefly now. Daniel Sherman is CEO of Biologics. After growing up in a family whose sole business was based in intensive horticulture and studying at Massey, he became focused on plant breeding and was successful in removing all the insecticides and fungicides from the plant breeding program there. He's got an interest in urban farming movement, about reconnecting food production with the urban population, working with farmers who want no part of agrochemical methods of the past, and helping prove the viability of this truly regenerative food system. Sarah Smuts-Kennedy is an artist, regenerative farmer, and originator of For the Love of Bees, the Urban Farmers Alliance, and new educational platform Regenerate Now, which all of our panelists are involved in. She has helped to establish Rongoa Garden in Griffiths Garden, OMG, a profitable 500 square metre teaching farm in Simon Street, compost hubs around Auckland, and pollinator plantings in public parks and schools. Sheldon Levitt is the farm and compost manager at KaiCycle Urban Farm in Newtown, Wellington. And KaiCycle is an urban farm community compost project established in 2015, which collects all its compost by bicycles, which is pretty fantastic. Sustainable transport for the win. And Sheldon is interested in the way that urban farms and community compost projects integrate and can help reimagine urban ecosystems and community cohesion. And finally, Bailey Perryman was the co-founder of Cultivate Christchurch, where he worked with disadvantaged youth to make compost and grow healthy food in inner city Christchurch. He's currently now working on a new composting project, starting a PhD on land remediation and fulfilling a contract with the Christchurch City Council, activating food initiatives within the Otakaro Avon River Corridor, which was formerly known as the residential red zone. So wonderful to have these four very knowledgeable and talented speakers on our panel this evening. It looks like we have over 80% of you have voted on the poll, so thank you for that. Looks like we've got about half the people involved in either agriculture or horticulture and viticulture. That's the area of regeneration that we're most interested in, and then 31% interested in urban, which is fantastic because that is, of course, today's conversation. And over half of us on the call this evening actually are living in a town or city in New Zealand. Fantastic, and welcome to the 13% of you who are from outside New Zealand. And looks like people have read at least some of the Our Regenerative Future content series, which adds a lot of context to some of the conversations we'll be having this evening. So thank you for getting involved in that poll. You'll notice that there is a Q&A box at the bottom. You can access that from the bottom bar. Please feel free to put your questions in there for our panelists this evening. We'll be putting those questions to them along with some that we've prepared, and also we'll live on Facebook this evening too, if you wanted to share it with anybody. And we're recording this call as well, just to let you know. All right, I think without further ado, we're going to crack into some questions for our panelists. I think let's start with quite a broad question. I think people living in a lot of New Zealand cities are quite often disconnected from where their food comes from. So I'd love to hear from the panelists, and maybe you can introduce yourselves a little bit as part of your answer. What do you think are some of the implications of this disconnection between food and our communities? Let's start with you, Sarah.
Well, actually, I prefer Bailey. If you would start with that question,
Sure.
I just think, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, kia ora everyone. Thanks for joining, and thanks for chucking me into this one, Sarah. But I think the short of it is it's massively disempowering. The result of that disconnection means that we're making poor food choices, can't distinguish between foods that are good for us and or otherwise. And I think it runs a lot deeper than that, and actually is reflected in I think inequities in the structure of our economy and educational outcomes. And I've mentioned health outcomes already. It all comes back from disconnection from the land. And so I'm third generation now, effectively removed from owning and operating an agricultural operation. And it's been an interesting journey back, starting in an urban context, and trying to find just a simple connection to having hands in the soil. But that was really the start of my journey about 10 years ago, was actually just realizing I wanted to learn to grow food. The earthquakes here in Christchurch around about 2010 when they kicked off, so 10 years ago, that was a major catalyst too. It woke me up big time as to where is my food coming from, and what if the supply chains are cut off, what am I going to do? And still now to this day, I don't really feel like I have anything like food security. So it's an ongoing battle, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think food security is certainly a very pertinent discussion at the moment, with disruptions to much of our supply chains as well. Sheldon, I'd love to go across to you, if you could speak to any implications you see with our disconnection.
Kia ora everyone, I'm Sheldon. I think I would agree heavily with a lot of Bailey's thoughts, and I think the thing I would add is that shock to the system that Christchurch had during the earthquakes. Wellington is very susceptible to similar shocks with a single supply chain in, and I think COVID in Wellington has germinated a lot of people into wanting to grow, but people just don't know how. They don't have the skills that our ancestors would have held for a very long time, which is leading to this disempowerment for everyone, whether they have food available or not. And I think health for me is definitely the long-term thing that we're going to see dropping off. Yeah.
Thanks, Sheldon. Daniel, what do you think are the implications between that disconnection between our food and
Good evening, everybody. My name is Daniel Sherman. I think it's basically the crux of it is what we talk about, the urban-rural divide. And so where you have not really a great understanding and that of how food is produced, that leads to a mistrust in the urban population of the food and where it comes from and how it's produced. Some of it obviously is grounded in some truth, but there's also a lot of misinformation in regards to the food production and impacts of it, for argument's sake. Obviously, a big part of that is driven through fear of food security, or that fear has been, I guess, propelling the interest in urban agriculture of late. But yeah, that disconnect is a major reason why we often have these discussions about the urban-rural divide, and not actually understanding what goes on in the food production side of the rural economy, for argument's sake.
Absolutely. Yes, that's why I love hearing about your initiatives, getting people going in the cities, given that they don't have access to those rural environments. Sarah, anything to add?
Yeah, so I think that sort of brings us to speak about why we've actually created or supporting the flourishing of an urban growing sector, is that that has multiple purposes. What initially had us really see that as really important to create an urban farm in Auckland, for example, was really to demonstrate to people that it is actually possible to grow at scale in ways that are beneficial to the environment. And we had the project For the Love of Bees, so we wanted to show you could grow at scale commercially in ways that were safe for bees. So it has so being able to demonstrate that these systems actually work, that regenerative agriculture is a really viable way of growing. For a lot of people, and most of New Zealanders do live in cities, they need to be able to see that. They actually need to spend time around them, learn the systems themselves, get comfortable with this. This isn't a pipe dream. This is a very real proposition, and it is being done. So that's one reason. So that is potentially also, with all of the a big chunk of the population in cities, we do need to grow new farmers. So, we see that our urban farms as being a space where we can actually grow a new generation of farmers that will actually potentially move out into the countryside. So capacity building. But over COVID, where, we started our projects a year ago with the primary driver for us collectively was around climate change mitigation, and really looking at regenerative horticulture, I suppose, is really a very credible way to fast track climate change mitigation and repairing ecosystems. But very quickly it's turned to food security issues, as well as waste recovery, which is another massive climate change mitigation problem being solved in these urban farms where organic waste is being turned into fertility in local ecosystems. But the food security one was really massive, and our urban farms continue to supply families over that lockdown period, in fact even in lockdown level 4. So and obviously at the moment our country is looking at food security big time coming down the wire in October. It's expected to really kind of peak, but also local jobs. So we see these urban projects as being teaching models, data collection centres, research centres, but also spaces that are actually very actively and very quickly within months able to attend to local food security while generating local jobs. On our 500 square metre site in Simon Street, we are now paying one farmer almost $1,000 a week to farm, and we're looking at taking on another person. So, this is real job creation, and at the same time, generating climate change mitigation outcomes too.
Fantastic to see those sorts of integrated solutions. Sarah, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the development of the Urban Farmers Alliance and what was the impetus behind that consolidation or connection.
Well, primarily capacity building. So, I mean, it's all very well for us to have a will to create urban farms, but it's a highly skilled sector. So what we wanted to do was to create a strategy for like-minded early adopter projects around the country to actually be able to fast track getting to the KPIs that we are all really committed to. But not only that, we really wanted to consolidate what those KPIs were. And so we started, I guess, Bailey, Daniel and I started doing conversations here in Auckland around the possibilities and the potential of urban agriculture. We were invited to go to Wellington, where we met Kai Cycle. Within months, we were actually meeting and formalising a concept called the Urban Farmers Alliance, which is essentially a peer-to-peer mentoring platform, which is managed over WhatsApp. It gives people a chance to ask a question and have that question answered at the level that they require it within 10 minutes, sometimes a couple of hours. And Daniel sort of oversees it, but however, foundation members are now really contributing to each other's learning. We're now supporting over 110 growers and composters around New Zealand through that platform. But the idea really is capacity building. How do we, as quickly as possible, become highly skilled practitioners delivering the KPIs that we're really interested in delivering?
Fantastic, thank you. I'd love to get into the nitty-gritty of the urban agriculture very soon. And just to remind everybody, you can put questions in that Q&A box for the panel. But first, I'd love to just go to horticulture a little bit more generally. Daniel, a lot of the conversation that we've been having around urban agriculture, both within this series and in general, seems to be quite focused on pastoral farming here in New Zealand. Can you speak a little bit to the effects of intensive agriculture on our soils in New Zealand? And what is the nature of regeneration of those kinds of systems?
Okay, so I'm assuming you're talking about intensive horticulture, I guess, rather than
yes,
agriculture. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously huge amount of talk and around, as you say, around pastoral systems, and a lot of sort of toing and froing about how positive or negative those are. There are obviously two sides that are arguing that case at the moment. But yeah, my experience of having done soil analysis right across New Zealand for many years, and particularly one of the key things we measure for argument's sake is soil carbon, which is obviously a big part of that conversation about regenerative ag, is that quite often pastoral systems actually have reasonably good carbon levels for argument's sake. So you often don't come across carbon in soils, just to give you some sort of idea of less than sort of 6 or 7%. There are a few exceptions to that around the country, but that generally the pastoral will be over 7, 8, 9, 10% of total carbon in the soil. When you start measuring intensive horticultural producers in conventional terms, we very often find levels below 3%. And 3%, for people that don't know, is basically zero, because carbon, you don't find soil without any carbon in it. But what you do find at 3%, the carbon cycle no longer functions. So essentially at that level, what we're dealing with at that point is what I consider pretty much a dead soil, a soil that has no real biological activity, no nutrient cycling really able to happen, because it simply doesn't have enough actual soluble carbon in the soil for that process to function. And this is the thing, I guess, that many people don't seem to understand or have conversations about, but those are our most degraded soils in New Zealand. Typically are found under those really intensive. Vegetable production would be, I guess, if you wanted to put it in a box, because you don't find that, for argument's sake, so much in kiwi fruit or orcharding or long term, but where you get really frequent heavy cultivation, tilling of the soil, we find that soils that were remarkably considered, very important soils in the country, often we find incredibly degraded. So, very, very low levels, without looking at toxicities or anything else like that, just looking at some of the basic soil health indicators. Forget finding worms, wouldn't even bother trying to count in most cases, when you've just got nothing there, there's nothing there to feed them. And these are the soils that we throw huge amounts of fertilizer on to actually grow a crop, because there's nothing there to grow the crop. So, and what you find as a consequence is that you have where a lot of nitrogen is required often to grow these heavily leafy and green crops. But as soon as it rains, there's nothing to hold that soluble nitrogen in the soil. So they have to, in many cases, that single heavy rain event will destroy a crop. From the point of view of the nitrogen's gone, they can't get on the field to put any more on because the field has no soil structure to it. It's just, you drive a tractor on it, you destroy anything that there's nothing really to destroy, but the tractor will disappear into the field because there's nothing to support it. So, that's the extreme end of what we're talking about, but there are literally thousands of hectares in New Zealand under intensive horticultural production that are our most degraded soils and what we were once considered our best soils.
Thank you. And my understanding is that the regeneration process is significantly longer for these kinds of horticultural soils than turning around, say, a sheep and beef farm.
Well, in many cases, the sheep and beef farm kind of has to modify their behaviours or improve with the knowledge that we're understanding how we can improve the process, but they're not starting from a really low point. So yes, in terms of how far you've got to go, time is not necessarily such a huge issue. There are ways of, because we're not talking, in many cases, like with sheep and beef, we can be talking, I've got some customers in excess of, 1,200 hectares, 20,000 acres in some of those stations. Obviously, you're very limited as to what you can do in that scale, but we've got a large-scale vegetable producer, there might still be 700 hectares, but they've got other tools available to them to address that quickly. But they're certainly starting, and I use that carbon analogy as a difference of starting at 3%, which essentially is 0, versus someone starting at 7, 8, 9%. Very, very big difference.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Sheldon, I'd love to put to you a question that's come through the box here from Alex McCall. How important is the role of soil in urban agriculture? Strikes me as pretty important.
Yeah, I guess if you're going to grow plants in the ground, soil is number one. Not dirt, but soil. But I guess it brings up this idea that we grow our food soillessly in hydroponic or aeroponic or aquaponic systems, which would use a lot of infrastructure to do, but we have the soil available. We've got huge amounts of so-called waste in our cities. Humans love to seem to still create that, but we can harness it very easily and build soil if we need it. But cities do also have lots of soil available. I think in terms of the regenerative side, it's making sure that we treat the soils properly with a good eye, and usually someone standing behind you like Daniel to watch what you're doing, and then keeping it alive and running, and you're away laughing, really. I don't personally have a lot of comment on the non-soil growing. I've only ever grown in soil.
Right. Yeah, seems no shortage of compost scraps that we could use. And there is a question here from John McLean about asking about the role of the urban compost bin and making green waste into beneficial enrichment from urban gardens. So is there a role for, someone who's got a standard old compost bin in their backyard? Sheldon.
Yeah, I guess urban agriculture also includes potentially connected backyard systems or different mosaics than what we're talking about at scale urban farming. But I guess one slight downside of thousands and thousands of little compost bins is it's maybe not quite as efficient as bringing it together at a street level or a suburb level and producing really high quality living compost that can be used right then and there to create quite a large garden. But all composting in the city is going to have a benefit to the soil around it.
Mm. Yeah, and perhaps there's a role there that technology might be able to play in the future in terms of connecting people that are composting near each other. Bailey, I'd love to come to you with a question actually now from Lucy Mary Mulholland. And I know you've got a background with Cultivate Christchurch in working with disadvantaged youth. So how do you see a need for social regeneration to be interwoven with this ecological regeneration, and how do you integrate these two streams?
It's a really good question, and first and foremost, like, I just don't see them as separate. So in an urban context, the work of the urban farmer is fundamentally social. Even from the standpoint of, if you were just having your own operation in your backyard, or a networked collection of backyard sites, you would have to be dealing with other people, whether it's your neighbours, your own family, or the people who own the other bits of land and give you access. So fundamentally, relationships are involved. They need to be given time, and there's a lot of communication and education that comes through in those ways. But that's sort of the soft end of the spectrum. At the much harder edge of, I guess, social issues, or where society is dysfunctional, is where you find the more structured work and the more purposeful initiatives, which are very much designed basically to collide people who are experiencing all kinds of basically symptoms or side effects of disconnection from land, disconnection from nature. You're basically just trying to collide them with some kind of experience of the power of the life forces that are running through nature, and the moment, it's remarkable how fast that can happen, though. How and the most vivid experiences for me personally at Cultivate are with working with teenagers, some of whom had been in the care and protection services since from being a newborn. They're fundamentally disconnected, and there's some instances when, with the case within a couple of weeks, you would see somebody going from complete shut off with maybe hood drawn over, and then something starts to trigger, and you just start to see this person lift up, hood comes off, and their world is literally opening up in front of your eyes. So it's tough to get any of that spark to happen, but it's really rewarding when you start to see it unfold, and it's literally like a blossoming happening in front of your eyes.
I would also say that what we're noticing at OMG, which is our farm in Simon Street, is just like, we have a full-time farmer, but we have at least 70 to 100 volunteer hours a week that happen on that site. And I'd say, Kai Cycle has similar experience. So where the public are able to use those sites for their own, for multiple reasons, but a very common one is mental health. And in Simon Street, we have a young man, Levi, who is our farmer. So obviously, whoever is farming changes the quality of that the farm. But we have a lot of men in their 30s and 40s who are using that site as an in-between space. They wouldn't necessarily go to counselling, but they like the highly skilled nature of the work. They like the extreme productivity of it, but they actually will come every day for a month and then suddenly disappear. They go back into life. But these urban farming projects do serve multiple functions, and I think the sort of social cohesion, the kind of the natural ability of nature to heal people is a very well used, it's one of the major uses of these sites in inner cities.
Yes, fantastic to hear of those sorts of integrated solutions. Sheldon, I know you're integrating sustainable transport into your model. Can you tell us a little bit about that decision for KaiCycle?
Yeah, so KaiCycle uses bikes to collect 50 tons of green waste.
Bikes with trailers, right? Or
yeah, and they're electric. Wellington would be an interesting pedal-powered
indeed
hilly mission. I guess the decision to do that really came from Wellington's not great for cars already. It's not really designed in the best way, and so trying to get around in a vehicle would have been a nightmare, stopping and starting, but also looking at, if you're going to integrate something into your model, what are the other effects of doing that? Just like various activities on the field could be detrimental in the future, the activities that we do off the field also need to be taken into account. And it also gets other people thinking. When people start to see you biking around collecting food waste, they wonder, what else could we do using this method of transport? And is there other ways to move stuff short distances in our cities? Which is encouraging to see. About 2 or 3 more businesses start in the city purely based around bike transport systems.
Well, that's fantastic to hear that you're having that kind of community effect. I'd love to go to a question now in the chat from Edgar Henson, and this is a question that's aimed at Sarah, but I think it would be great to hear from other panelists what's happening around the country. But Edgar says Auckland Council has a lot of available land, but only 2 community gardens. What's the opportunity there?
Well, there's massive opportunity. There are actually more community gardens. I'd say Auckland actually has a lot of community gardens, but one of the things that we're really talking about is quite distinct from community gardens into urban farms. And what we say is gardens grow plants and farms grow food. So what we're talking about is, and all of the farms that we are helping emerge are using the CSA model, which is a community supported agriculture. So looking at, for example, 500 square meters we know can produce 40 CSA boxes a week. That's feeding, and each box should feed 4 people, so that you can extrapolate out how many people can be fed from a certain size. We're looking at the moment to try and get farms in Auckland and in fact around New Zealand and Wellington as well, between 2,500 square metres, 5,000 square metres, where you're suddenly looking at 400 CSA boxes a week. And then you're starting to look at being able to employ 10 to 15 people. You are generating a really good revenue. So these projects need seed funding. And then actually they become self-sustainable within a year to 18 months. So there's a lot of land in all of our cities actually, and our vision is to have an urban farm every 1 kilometre. That's what it's going to take for us to actually get the critical mass, to get the KPIs that we're interested in. And so there are resource management, there's a whole lot of bylaws that need to be changed to make it be able to potentially sell from council-owned land. But there are also land, there's churches, there's a lot of land. Land isn't the issue. It's actually having a vision and imagination for the transformation of what that land can do, and the seed funding to enable those projects to actually start and be successful in the period that they need to be to actually support people. We at the moment have been looking at Albert Park for a 5,000 square metre farm. That looks like it might be too tricky, but at the moment we're looking at Fraser Park, which is in Parnell. But already with the Waitemata Local Board, they have been really thrilled with OMG and its capacity to become a self-sustainable business that's meeting all of those KPIs. And there's a real will to, and I know Wellington Council similarly are really excited about the capacity of these urban farms to attend to food security, climate change mitigation, waste recovery. But there are some changes that have to be made, and these things do need to be seed funded. And we're really hoping that government see the Urban Farmers Alliance strategy. We have the recovery farm package that we put out at the, in lockdown level 4, which really I think is a very credible way for fast tracking ecosystem restoration, food security that isn't food banks, but actually long-term food security, but actually also generating quite substantial jobs.
Yeah, you've got everything in there by the sounds of it. You've got waste recovery, employment, climate change mitigation, mental health, and on mental health, we had a really great community and mental health conversation much earlier in the series with John O'Frew and Sam Lang. I think there was episode 4, if anybody wants to check out the recording. A really rich conversation around how getting involved in the land can be very beneficial to mental health. I'd love to come back to that question of finances and barriers in a moment, but I just want to give Sheldon and Bailey the opportunity to speak to whether what sort of opportunities they see in Wellington and Christchurch.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So my current role on part-time contract with Christchurch City Council, some may or may not be aware that as a result of the earthquakes, there was 400 hectares of housing cleared alongside the Avon River, which stretches from the centre of Christchurch City out to the eastern suburbs and for reaching the ocean. And that land is deemed uninhabitable for housing, but is essentially a river corridor that is speaking very clearly that it needs to be recovered. So my role is to look at the areas within that total land area which are more suited to productive land uses, everything from community gardens through to there have been independent reports looking at different agribusiness options for that land as well, and horticulture is definitely coming out on top there. So there's the potential there for a continuous productive urban landscape, and of course even before that, before we made a mess of it as an urban settlement, it was used as a food basket and harvested from by mana whenua, Ngāi in particular. And so there's a fantastic array of land uses that are going to open up there that'll be not just for those who live immediately by the area still, but for the rest of the city, and of course as an exemplar to the world really, what's possible for the use of this kind of space within an urban area.
Okay, thank you. Sheldon, what opportunities do you see in Wellington?
I think there's a similar potential of a large rollout of urban food. I think Wellington, one thing it lacks is lots of flat land. So I think some big potential there is really honing in and getting some good skills on hill-based farming that is as productive as the flat land. There's a lot of hilly land that is around, and I think as well, not far from the edges of the city limits is quite large quantities of intensive market gardens. And so how can the urban farms connect in with those relatively close regional farms? And maybe I'll leave my other comments for the barriers question.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, I'd love to ask you a little bit. There's a question here from Katrina Wolf. It'd be great to hear if there are businesses and corporates backing urban farming projects, or if it's dependent on the sort of funding used by community gardens. So I wonder if you could speak briefly just to the financials of urban regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are businesses, certainly participating within the urban farming sector. So there are businesses like Carbon Cycle, for argument's sake, which are large supporters, otherwise previously known as the New Zealand box composting system. You know, that's obviously there are those type of companies involved, and there's a range of them. I mean, including ourselves, but yeah, it's largely being funded through, you know, local government support. Really, Sarah can probably speak much better to that experience along with the others than I can. Sorry. But to answer the other side of that question is looking at the economics, I guess, around, you know, how do these urban farming projects sort of stand up? And that's an area that I do have a lot of involvement in, because we're trying to get for these farms to be standalone. So although the funding might have come from various different sources, actually thinking another company was Fenton Billboards, of course, it gave a lot of support, has given a lot of support in the past to like the OMG project there in Auckland and the Flower of Bees. But to look at the economics, I want to look at it from a purely business point of view as to how do these businesses remain sustainable. So the model that they would require continuous funding, for argument's sake, from communities, associations and local councils, to me was kind of flawed, because we've had the perfect example lately with COVID-19, that the vast majority of the funding that was going to be available to some of these projects has just literally evaporated overnight. So it really highlighted the fact that we had to build business, we had to basically have a business model that was sound, and it was based around, in my experience with horticulture, it's all about productivity. Many people do focus on, you know, like maximizing the price that they sell a product for, but in actual fact, success in horticulture and agriculture systems, in my experience, is pretty broad with that around the world as well, as it's actually all about productivity. And so we had to make these systems incredibly productive, because they don't have massive area. So generally what you find is the larger the scale of the agricultural businesses, the less efficient they are per square metre. So as you bring these things down to 500 square metres, obviously you haven't got any room to waste. You haven't got time to waste. You have to have that thing producing at incredible levels. And to put it in real dollar terms is what we try and to get people to help to understand, is that you know, if you're looking at, and I won't talk about pastoral systems because they're on a very different scale, but on other horticultural systems, the best you can probably hope to, that I see in turnover, is maybe $300,000 a year at best for, say, gold kiwi fruit. And there'll be some growers out there that find that hard to believe that someone's achieving that, because the average is well, it's probably less than 200. But that's kind of the best. You know, avocado, we know how expensive that fruit is, but at best they're doing $100,000 a hectare from an avocado orchard, and most are much, much lower than that. We're looking at, say, the OMG model, for argument's sake. At the moment, it's modelling around, if you extrapolate it per metre out to a hectare, so we're comparing apples with apples, you're talking about $1.3 million per hectare. And we have projects in the system that we've measured, I think 1.6 was at the upper end of that per hectare. You know, so what we're talking about is incredible productivity can be achieved. And you have to remember that in the vast majority here, we're talking about, without fertilizer, the nutrition support is basically through composting and through understanding the soil biology system. And this is the essence of regenerative agriculture, is actually working with the soil system and understanding that soil biology.
Those are some very compelling figures in terms of productivity. Do you think that's scalable on a large scale?
The business model, and it's hard sometimes to get your head around it when, like myself, you come from very conventional business in terms of how you measure profitability and success. And although in real terms we're talking about profitability, you know, the actual sustainability of this has been able to pay the farmer. We're looking at a minimum of $25 an hour. We're looking at that sort of being based on a 40-hour week, and we're looking at what that farmer can produce within that space. And so that might be 50% of the total turnover is going towards labour. But in actual fact, when you look at it that way, is because the larger the scale gets, so when we get up to 5,000 square metres, for argument's sake, we have a bit more automation coming into it. You know, so there is a bit more in there, but we're talking about a model at the moment that is quite labour intensive, but that is kind of how that's how the people in that environment actually connect with the soil. You know, they have no love of they're not going to get in it. You're not talking about the scale we're getting in a GPS guided tractor and the person actually never sets foot in the field, you know, and covers hundreds of hectares. That's in per square, again, as we're talking about per square metre, we're talking about very low returns. And to give people an idea, because people think of, you know, I think one of the questions before talked about, you know, how much, I guess, thinking how much land is actually available. Well, you got 4,000 parks in Auckland alone. In the 25 regional parks, Auckland has 42,000 hectares. You know, this is all within the community land. So we're not all talking about turning all of that into food production by any major stretch of the imagination. But like Sarah says, land is not the issue here. It's how we're utilising, how we're farming and how we're utilising and how we're managing that soil. It's all at a much more basic level. But the opportunity is about, so the keys to supporting these projects is that CSA, that community supported agriculture model, where somebody wants food, you know, from a local source, because like OMG, our target is basically everybody that would hopefully get their food from OMG from these CSA boxes could arguably walk there and pick it up. You know, we don't want to put it on a courier and ship it, you know, across the city or anything like that. That's not the model that we're talking about. This is very much localized food production. But as you know, we keep pointing out here, is that this it makes an awful lot of people much more passionate about their food and interested about how their food grows. And you can see as we go through this process that we can scale that up. But the fact is, the more people involved in it, the more that are likely to actually get. And we do have people in that model now that are talking to us, you know, that are more larger scale market gardens, so 10, 12 hectares or, you know, or larger, sort of following along these no-till regenerative practices.
Got it. Thank you. Let's come to that question of barriers. Sheldon, what do you see as some of the big barriers to scalability or to your work in general, and what are the roles that perhaps local authorities, councils or others can play to help remove those barriers?
One barrier is possibly this issue of imagination when we look at these green squares dotted over our cities, and then archaic hangovers of legislation. Those people are long gone, but there's lots of bylaws, both at the council level and at the state level, that never thought in a wildest dream we might want to grow food in the city. And so we now have to go back and look at some of this legislation and allow it to have some of these things done on it. Particularly the Reserves Act is one that, yeah, in one interpretation you could easily farm as long as you don't have any goats, but in other interpretations it's quite narrow, purely because urban farming wasn't around in the 70s. But I guess in Wellington in particular, I was in a meeting today and there's a draft report due to be submitted to the council soon that recommends a lot of these things, that recommends that a work stream is developed in Wellington to basically understand what land is available, who owns it, what state is it, and create a mandate to a community food council to begin allowing some of that policy work to be undertaken. So I think Wellington is potentially really beginning to push ahead and see the potential here. But the biggest barriers at the moment for us is policy and bylaw.
Got it. I'd love to come back to goats in a minute, but Sarah, I'm curious to hear if you've noticed any difference with a slightly different council structure than we see in most of the country, with a consolidated super council as such. Has that meant any changes in terms of the way that you have to work with local authorities? Oh, you're on mute.
I just say it's just super complicated, being a super city. What we're finding post-COVID is that there's a really massive conversation happening in all areas of Auckland City around the opportunity for urban farming to attend to food security as a primary thing. A lot of marakai projects, but they're all at that kind of conceptual stage. And what's really missing is an integrated policy or plan for enabling these things to happen. Last year, we were all involved in a climate change action plan, discussions about, what could happen in our city to make us climate change ready. There's just been so much talking done and so little action. Really, the action that's been taken by our communities, and they're massively under-resourced. So while people are talking about these things, communities like ours are just, there's burnout. There is a frustration that, we can't get funding from MPI, we can't get, the Ministry of Environment has actually been really supportive, but I would say, Auckland Council is in a really bad place financially right now. And there's never been more need for these projects to be, actioned. We have in South Auckland, there really is a food desert out there, and there's a serious issue around access to nutrient-dense food. But also we have a massive issue around waste recovery. And in Auckland, we have been looking and investing in a biodigester to take our organic waste and ship it down country and turn it into heat, essentially. And we just see that is a massive waste of resources, that actually the very same organic waste could easily, a better investment is to keep it in the environment where it has been created and to turn it into opportunity and climate change mitigation opportunity, but also, jobs. I mean, jobs are the next big thing we need to be thinking about. One of the things I think it would be a super shame not to mention by the time we had ended this is just how amazing these farms are at in terms of carbon capture drawdown. And while there is a lot of conversation at the moment around, sequestering carbon in soils, what is really possible to measure is the above ground biomass that is actually, is captured carbon. And and that's measured by productivity. And the systems that we are encouraging people to take up in the urban farming have massive productivity and massive above ground biomass, which really, Daniel, I wonder if you might just share some of the data around that, because I think in terms of getting your imaginations triggered and feeling really inspired about the opportunity for regenerative urban agriculture to make a big difference in regards to our drawdown requirements, that's what has me be in this project, are those opportunities. Daniel, could you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a huge amount of, I guess, conversation around this whole carbon sequestration, and that's, particularly where we hear that coming through from the pastoral side of things, and how effective these regenerative systems can be in actually increasing the amount of carbon. But often, yes, we are only talking about, more often than not, measuring the carbon in the soil. But one of the systems, and the name just escapes me off the top of my head at the moment, but essentially when you start embracing this sort of, this whole process, and you create these healthy soils that have this healthy carbon cycle, nutrient cycle process happening in the soil, is you create a massive abundance above the soil. And the vast majority of the carbon in the world is actually held in plant material, actually above the soil. That's where our biggest carbon store is. The soil follows that. But the sort of examples that are talked about, and I'm just trying to think of the research that came out of New Mexico University, their regenerative agricultural sort of research facility there. I mean, they're talking about as much as 19 tons of carbon per hectare per year in a fully activated biological system. So, when you've really got this regenerative process happening, versus what's happening in our conventional systems, often you're talking that is 5 or 6 times. These regenerative systems can be 5 or 6 times higher than what we're currently achieving in our conventional agricultural approach to it. So there's a lot, there's a lot of science being, a lot of study being around there, and there's some people really leading the cutting edge of that. But it shows the true potential of creating a food system which is incredibly carbon positive, rather than having these conversations about how negative our food system is to the carbon. We can argue one way or the other and many times, but in these sorts of systems, it's so overwhelmingly carbon positive from the amount of carbon being captured, not only in the ground but above ground, that there is little argument to be had.
Yeah, it sounds like there's quite the opportunity for a reframe there, and if we change our processes a little. I was going to ask about the involvement of animals. I know we've only got a couple of minutes left though, so if anyone wants to weave that into their last 30-second thoughts, that would be great, but I would love to give you all the opportunity to just say anything that's still on your mind. Bailey, you had your hand raised there.
Yeah, I mean, there's interesting, we've touched on some of the bylaws and policy and plan and constraints, but it's the river corridor I've mentioned a couple of times. There's a whole regeneration plan, and that has then created overlays in our planning framework. And there's a rule within that animals grazing is allowed in that area up until the 1st of July 2024. And I can't get a clear answer from any of the planners yet about why that date. I'm imagining that it's something to do with the overall vision for the space is ecological restoration, and they see animals in there as being counterproductive to that. So they've time limited where the animals can be used in that space. The area is large enough for us to dream of and implement some kind of rotational system where we have stock closely cared for and probably brought back into shelter in the evenings by a caretaker in residence who's looking at a continuous area of around 40, sometimes maybe even 50 or 60 hectares. The most efficient way to manage that landscape would be to involve animals, and the most efficient way to achieve regeneration of the land and soils to that area would be to involve animals as well. So I would love to see integration of animals, and I'm starting to do some work with staff at Lincoln University about that. So yeah, it's got a huge role to play.
Fantastic. Sarah, instead of giving you your 30 seconds, I'd love to put to you a quick question that's come from Annabelle Langbein. Can you advise, I know you mentioned there around food desertification, and there was a question around that earlier, the viability of providing low-cost produce to low-income households in free food banks or schools? Oh, you're on mute again. We'll just have to unmute you. Yep.
It's absolutely huge. I mean, the thing about these farms are so productive that you can actually produce enough food to actually sell enough to pay all your wages and have plenty to give away. And that's one of the things that we've been doing modelling around. We already give 2 CSA boxes of our 40 away to a group called Awhina Mai, who we've been working with who are Māori with lived experience of homelessness. but also that community gets to be we're really looking at the moment as what does urban farming mean in relation to, a Māori, and Marakai, Maramataka. So, in terms of what I would say about the urban farming movement and why we're here is that it's extremely joyful. It's incredibly optimistic. We feel like we are really making a difference, and we can see that happening. And I think being able to make this available, Common Unity are a classic example in Wellington, who are, really are feeding their community by growing locally. But the opportunity is, I see that we need to take this out of being in a voluntary sector into being a new economic sector. So we're really looking at systems that can enable you to actually have a business and feed your local community. And if that includes giving some of it away, then if you're that productive, that's a possibility.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. I love that, making it a real economic industry. We rapidly run out of time a little bit over here. So Sheldon, 30 seconds, any final thoughts from you?
Maybe just adding on briefly to Annabelle's thoughts. I fully agree with Sarah that a lot of these farms are already social enterprises. KaiCycle's been providing huge amounts of food for the last 5 years to an organisation called Kiwis. But I think as well, looking at things like living food banks. There's many cities around the world that the food bank doesn't buy food; it employs a farmer. One example of that would be the Ottawa food bank, and then schools. Rather than shipping in food, we could just have a garden on the school field and easily integrate children into that from a really early age. So I think this is all possible, and this is definitely an underlying thread in a lot of the conversations in this movement.
Thanks, Sheldon. Daniel, any final thoughts?
Yeah, a lot, but I should summarize it into 30 seconds. The key when you're starting to talk about, when I started the conversation about productivity being the underlying sort of driver to being the sustainable, what drives the sustainability and success of these projects. There are projects out there where already the goal is they're giving away more than 50% of the food. So they're only actually basically having to recover their costs. Once they recover the costs by selling whatever percentage of food they need to do that, whatever else they produce is simply given away or sold at a very low cost into needy communities. That's a very strong part of, of some of the projects that we're looking at here. And in my, when I'm working with projects and trying to help to develop their business models, we try and produce a model where they're able to give away 25%, or in some cases, we're talking about a model where we've got give your CSA. So somebody might buy 2 boxes, and one gets donated. So the farmer isn't necessarily, is compensated for his cost of producing the food, but the food's still being given away to somebody or families that need it. So this is all about a change to our food system, and it is very much driven by the social need, and the whole idea that we can grow. I get a real problem with, say, organic and regenerative production, that it just wants to be focused about how they can get more money for their food. When I already look at, food for many people is already too damn expensive. If you want to make more money and be more successful as a farmer, learn how to actually be more productive and not focus on some sort of marketing influence that can mean you can charge 2 or 3 times more for your food because it's regeneratively grown. Regenerative is the key. Being regenerative is the key to actually achieving that productivity.
Very good point. All about healthy food, healthy people, thriving communities, healthy environment.
But
Love
also,
it.
can I say one last thing, is that actually a lot of those communities in need actually would love to be able to learn to grow. And so this is why we've created the Regenerate Now platform, is that, you know, anyone who wants to participate in this urban farming sector, I believe, should have access to the knowledge that they need. And so we've been trying to, that's part of the Urban Farmers Alliance, but it's also part of the Regenerate Now, is that actually this is highly skilled work, but it's work that can be learnt in months.
Wonderful. Hey, thank you so much to all our panelists this evening, and thank you for sticking with us. I know we've gone a few minutes over this evening. It's been fantastic to have everybody along with us this evening. So please do join us next week. We've got a conversation around regenerative tourism with Trent Yeo from down in Queenstown, rather. Eco Trek Zip Tours, Dr. Suzanne Becken from over in Australia, Sustainable Tourism Professor, and Larissa Cooney from Bay of Plenty Tourism. That'll be a really interesting conversation given the situation our tourism industry finds itself in. And then finally, we've got our series finale for the Our Regenerative Future series, and it's an episode where we'll be drawing everything together around forestry, tourism, agriculture, horticulture, and exploring the topic of how we can move toward a regenerative economy for New Zealand, and particularly for New Zealand's primary sector. We'll have Rod Oram, Dame Anne Salmond, Mike Taitoko, and Hamish Bielski on that call, which are all panelists we've already had in this series. So it'll be really drawing together a lot of big picture thinkers. That will be a 90-minute special episode. So we'll be able to dive a little bit deeper into that one. Please do join us for the next couple. Keep an eye on the Pure Advantage and Edmund Hillary Fellowship Facebook, Instagram pages for all the details, or you can go to pureadvantage.org or ehf.org for details. Thank you so much again for joining us. It's been wonderful to have you. And thank you to all our panelists once more. Ka kite.